Alrighty, so now we're moving on to the famous second will, which he nicknames the Nobleman. Um, so let me collect my thoughts here. So first of all, these next two sections, the 2V second will section and the 3V third will section, are somewhat extreme in opposite ways. Uh, we know that Afanasiev is very optimistic about the second position, and we know that he is, pessimistic about the third position in the way he uh, describes it, and in the way he imputes like the mindset behind these positions, right? Like the second position is like normative, and it's self-positive and strong, and it's others positive, so it has this like overall like positive nature to it. uh, Whereas like the first is, it's self-positive, it's strong, but it's others negative, and it has like protective and kind of aggressive element to it. The third is self-negative and others negative, so its overall uh, affect or valence is negative. um, and So I think that he goes too far with how great the second function is. Like to him, like the second function is just like this great thing. And in fact, in his idea of the kind of ultimate personality, it's about making all your functions more like the second function. Um, my intuition so far, learning about this theory and comparing it to attitudinal psyche, um, and my past knowledge, I don't believe that that's the case. I think really what it is all the functions or positions should be neutralized, um, at least to some extent. So you can imagine someone who goes overboard with their first function. Their first function needs to be made more like the fourth. Okay, it needs to chill out. It needs to be a little bit more, uh, a little bit more humble, right? The third needs to be made a little bit more optimistic, a little more sanguine, right? Like the second. The fourth, could use kind of a kick in its butt. It could use a little bit of energy, right? So it should be made more like the first, more confident, more of a doer, and less of a irresponsible kind of taker, or an avoider of spending time thinking about whatever aspect is in that position. And it would follow that the second position should be made should be more like the third. And I think that there is an over positivity with the second. There's an over optimism. There's too much play with it, and it's fickle, and it's changeable, mutable, right? Because it's like the flexible position. So you also have to know, if you didn't pick up on this already, uh, that in Afanasiev's view, volition has like a privileged place in this system. So it's not like, well, there's logic and emotion and physics and volition, and they're all kind of like equal. It's like, yeah, kind of, but volition's a little bit more important than the others. And that's because he identifies it with like the ego, in the sense of like self and the I, right? And it's kind of like the director of the self, the steerer. Okay, and that makes some sense. But I also kind of disagree. Not I don't want to say disagree. Maybe that's too strong, but I would walk it back and equalize these aspects a little bit more. Um, and with that, I also wonder what the nature of the will is, and volition, we could say, if we want to call it the will, volition, whatever. But to me, I'm not sure if I associate it so much with this sense of like self, sense of I. I would say there is the ego, but that's not like for example, for a 1E type, the ego is associated with emotion. For the 1F type, the ego is associated, the I, the sense of self, is really associated with physics. Okay? So I don't know. It's a nuance, but it's important, and it becomes important in these next two sections because if he was dick sucky about the second position and he's dick sucky about will, can you guess the level of blowjob that he's going to give to the second will? It's notorious. And in psychosophy proper, not so much attitudinal psyche, but in psychosophy, it's like, oh, the second will, the good child, the angel, right? And I'm a second will type, and it's like I think it's too much, and he makes too much of the side of will, which has to do with like power and power over people. But I think there's another side of. I don't want to make this preface so long that it eats up into the video, although so far it's been only about 7 minutes. But it is probably important because you'll notice that the second will is just a very positive chapter. And then the third will is like very negative, where you walk away like, how can a third will type be a good person? And I think what could happen is there might be people who are really self-hating and they're like, well, I guess, I'm third will then. But it's like, are you? And there might be people who, maybe have a decent view of themselves and maybe they're like good people and they'll go, well, I can't be third will because that's like a bad person. And yeah, it's like he just kind of like went too far. And what I would say is that to me, what volition, like my head canon for this system, what I call or think of will when I think of the system, I call it potentia, okay, which means potential. And potential is two-sided. It's about possibilities. It's about that sort of like mutable potential essence within something, within a thing, a person, okay? The spirit, right? It's kind of like the spirit is in superposition because it deals with the future. The future hasn't happened yet. It can go multiple ways, okay? So within potentia, there's the future possibilities, potential side of things. And then potentia also means potent, like potency, which means, comes from the Latin root for power, right? Potens. So it means both possibilities, the future, and power. And what we do is we have visions of the future, not just the far future science fiction. That might be more like logic related, or even emotion if it's more of like a fantasy, right? A story, a fantasy. But when we're talking about like the actionable future, the future that we have control over, that is the future that we, by our power, by our exertion of energy, can collapse into an actuality. We can collapse the superposition into reality. Okay? And that's what the will deals with. Okay? Potentia, the spirit, the will, volition, whatever you want to call it. It's seeing the potential in things, the opportunities, and then acting on it. But you'll notice in these chapters on will, but especially these next two, it gets less into that first side of things. And that first side of potentia is really related a lot to Jung's intuitive function. And I hope you can see the parallel with intuition there. Now, socionics kind of confuses things. If you know about socionics, just kind of like forget that and just think mostly like Jung and MBTI. Because if you notice, like the way in MBTI, INTJs and ENTJs, especially out of the NI types, are described, They're described in a very 1V way, right? Because it's that like driven, determined vision, that introverted vision that is protective, but it's like long term and it's excessive. And it divides not just people, not just society into like the elites and the lower, right? But it divides the universe into that so that there's another realm beyond this lower realm. So it has like a spiritual and mystical side. In, psychological types, Jung described, the way he characterized NI. He said, well, there's like prophets. A lot of prophets had introverted intuition, and that makes sense when you think of that kind of very like Moses like prophet, right? That kind of like driven leader of people who has this vision, and he's not going to stop until the vision is realized, right? So will has a lot to do with vision and seeing possibilities. So it's like when you think of 2V, in my opinion, 2V is essentially what we thought NE was all along, extroverted intuition. Okay, 2V and extroverted intuition are parallels. And if you notice, if you read Attitudinal Psyche on Rob's website and you go through his description, you'll notice these parallels. Okay, so really, what is second will? Well, it's the same thing that extroverted intuition was. Okay, especially in MBTI descriptions, and as well as socionics. Socionics and NE kind of carried over. So think of extroverted intuitive types. Think of how they kind of had this, in socionics, they were dick sucked then too. Okay, and think of that, but think of that nature to them. This sort of like buoyant, optimistic, kind of chill, open to collaboration, seeing multiple ways the future could go, like noticing people's potential and wanting to like spark potential in others, right? That's NE, and it's also 2V. So I guess I'm trying to kind of explain and prepare you for why 2V gets this very positive, description. And it's because the future is important, okay, and power is important. And so the more like flexible, the person who's very like flexible and accommodating about the future and where we're going to take things, that almost gives it like a privileged spot where it has this like very attractive nature to it. Now, the thing is, if we want to be like, if we want to think in terms of the intertype relations, then we can't say that 2V is like, I don't know, objectively good, because then how would that work with it having like, not animosity, but it not meshing well with 1Vs and 4Vs, right? Because 2V is complementary to 3V, but not to the other types. So I don't think 2V is actually, the best thing since sliced bread or whatever. 2V is fickle. It sees a lot of futures, and it wants to sure like collaborate and build something, but it's really just getting enjoyment out of that sparking of potential, right? It's not unlike 1V. 2V is not long term. It's fickle. It's more tactical. It changes direction a lot, and it just kind of enjoys the process of building a future, the process of like exerting power to shape the future, and the process of envisioning ways things could go, different ways things could go, and being like pleasantly surprised by the contributions of others in the way that the future is built. Which should to you ring, it should sound a little bit like extroverted intuition, because it is the same thing. That's one of my big things that I'm going to talk about later after the series, is my syncretist beliefs about typology. So yeah, before I drag on too long, it's been almost like 15 minutes, but I think it's important. I just wanted to add it in here because if anyone happens, I God love you, listening through this whole series, and you're new to psychosophy, you might kind of be concerned or just I don't know. These next two sections might like trip you up. Like, why is 2V so good? Why is 3V so bad? Um, and I'll say more about 3V at the beginning of that section, but for now, I will get on with it. I will continue, but I just wanted to say my piece there. So the nobleman, and I'm gonna interject once again. He characterizes he nicknames these types, king or czar, and then nobleman, and then like philistine. He also calls 3V bourgeois, in keeping with this kind of like political hierarchy. And then he calls 4V serfs. The only thing I would say at this point is, I wouldn't, maybe not nobleman for the nickname for 2V. I would say more like free man. Okay, like in history, throughout history, there have been many societies, oftentimes republics, that have had this large middling class of free landholders. Okay, so think of like, Anglo-Saxon England with the Thanes, or the early, Roman Republic, okay, with the citizen farmer soldiers, or the early American Republic, where you have this like large body of free men who don't really exert, a ton of power over society, but um, they're also relatively free to do their own thing. Okay, and that's kind of like the nature of 2V, analogized to society, is kind of that like free man, who's not looking to control others, and he's looking to be independent himself. Okay, now I will get into it after 17 minutes and 19 seconds. Perhaps the most difficult thing when talking about the psychology of the second will is to explain to oneself and others what processivity and normativity are, obligatory for the second function, in their volitional expression, and nevertheless I will try. The processional nature of the second will is what is usually denoted in official language by the words collegiality and delegation of responsibility. Possessing sufficient fortitude to take personal responsibility for what is happening in his domain, the nobleman, unlike the czar, nevertheless avoids subordinating the will of others, tries to involve all interested parties in solving the problem, assigning himself the place of the initiator, stimulator, and guardian of consensus. Rejection of dictate, the desire for full dialogue when making decisions. This is the processional nature of the second will. And I think the section is good. Don't get me wrong. There's not going to be a ton I complain about, but there's just my preface needed to be said. So. But it's good so far. The embodiment of the same nobility is the so-called delegation of responsibility. Alien to the craving for petty care, the second will, without generally removing responsibility from itself, strives to share it with all participants in the matter, giving them complete freedom of forms of implementation. The two American presidents, Reagan and Bush, are very different people, but both have the second highest will, so those who worked with them know one common trait, not characteristic of, for example, Carter, the desire for delegation of responsibility. As for normativity, in the second will it is embodied in the equal ability without internal tension and damage to both rule and obey. The second will is strong and flexible, so it is equally easy to be given a position of authority and a subordinate position. However, although the situation in itself is comfortable, it does not completely satisfy the nobleman. The ideal position for the second will is not to rule and not to obey at all, which rarely anyone succeeds in our interdependent world, but is the secret dream of all nobles. Yeah, it's just such a depressing, like black pilling issue for me, is that just dreaming, and I think I said this before in some other section, but just kind of like having this dream of a completely like equal and collaborative like friend group, and we're all kind of I don't know, investing and building up skills and, you know, exchanging ideas. And it's just like this very like collaborative, what do they call it? Like mastermind group, right? Um, that's the ideal. Nobody ruling, no super strong personalities, just dominating. But we're getting stuff done, and we're like growing and evolving, and we're bringing other people in. Like that's the fun of that's the way 2V plays. Okay, it's creating the future together. If we try to look deeper into the normativity of the second will, it turns out that it is characterized by that structure and that fortitude that are sufficient to create a regime of personal independence and free breathing for others. In one of his letters, Goethe said, "I am busy raising my grandson. It consists in the fact that I allow him to do absolutely whatever he pleases, and I hope to educate him in this way before his parents return." Inner freedom and the ability to free others is the true norm of will. One modern playwright described his second will very well and accurately, without knowing it. By character, I am not a leader, but I am not endowed with a herd instinct either. Obviously, I am a hybrid of a leader and a follower. He even tried to give his own children as much freedom as possible. I suggest you follow me. Who wants, please no, whatever. But I can't follow someone myself. I can admire certain qualities of a person, especially his talent, but I would not obey. Even Chekhov and Dostoevsky. I'm afraid of the elemental crowd, but this does not mean that I only love loneliness. On the contrary, I love being with people, and even just the presence of people is pleasant for me. Nobleman is the darling of fate. The basis of the human psyche, will, occupies the best second line in its order of functions, and thus provides the owner of the second will with spiritual comfort unknown to others. The strength and flexibility of the second will gives the individual rare integrity and fearlessness before life. So yeah, you can see there that's kind of the gist of what I don't want to say complaining about, but just warning about. And just yeah, I won't say more. Even the vulnerability of the third function, which the second will is not able to cancel, still worries the nobleman less than others, and the picture of his pathology in the third function is usually thoroughly blurred. In addition, the fearlessness generated by the strength and flexibility of the second will allows the nobleman to boldly take the risk of successfully closing the ulcer using the third function and, despite blows, mistakes, falls, achieve its complete healing. Thanks to this, the ideal state for a person living in the sublunary world is sometimes achieved, a state of complete internal harmony. My life is a complete adventure, for I have always strived not only to develop what was inherent in me by nature, but to obtain what she did not give me at all, wrote Goethe. And in another place, he himself explained why this was necessary. He who is not imbued with the conviction that all manifestations of the human being, sensuality and reason, imagination and reason, must be developed by him to a decisive unity, no matter which of these abilities predominates, he will constantly suffer in joyless limitation. I will not undertake to prove that harmonization is always given to a nobleman easily and quickly. The same Goethe reached this state only at the age of 60. I will not risk asserting that for others it is unattainable, but the presence of unique mental prerequisites for the achievement of internal harmony, there is no doubt about it. Okay. I remember I once had a chance to compare the second function with a river. So the second will is not a function, but a man river, an integrally inexhaustible personality, freely, widely, generously drinking to everyone who wants it without losing anything. Generosity are simply, the word repeats, but generosity and maybe in free giving are simply a normal state for the second will. The first thing they usually say about a nobleman is, he is a good man. Then less flattering characteristics and not flattering ones may follow, but when a person's description begins with such a phrase, it is more than likely that we are talking about the second will. Charlotte von Stein, long abandoned by Goethe, nevertheless found the strength in words to express to him in a letter, I would like to call you the giver. Here the word giver is very precisely found to express what constitutes the being of the second will. The nobleman has a big heart. I don't want to offend anyone, but only the second will is given the ability to truly love. I don't know about that. True love is self-giving. and only those who are ready to share, who have something to give, and give without the risk of impoverishment, are capable of self-giving. Only the second will meets all these conditions. Therefore, may the reader forgive me. It is given to others to need, to depend, to obey, to have illusions, but not to love. Love is understood by the second will as sacrifice, not consumption. For her, it is much more important to love than to be loved. Although its strength, flexibility, normativity, one of the fundamental elements of the second function is naturalness. Although it is difficult to talk about the naturalness expressed through will, the specificity of just such an expression can be isolated. Naturalness by will is personal openness, simplicity, adequacy to oneself in any situation, the absence of a background or mask. As Nancy Reagan wrote about her husband, the key to unlocking the secret of Ronald Reagan is that there is no secret. He is exactly what he seems. The Ronald Reagan you see in public is the same Ronald Reagan with whom I live. It turns out that some of the recent presidents were not at all what we imagined them to be. I honestly don't believe anyone could say anything like that about Ronnie. Yes, this is precisely the naturalness of a nobleman. His mental health is so great that without sticking anything out, he doesn't hide anything. He allows you to laugh at himself and is often ready to play playful self-flagellation. However, the second will is so personally invulnerable that, without serious violence against itself, it decides to do the worst thing: public repentance, open recognition of its mistakes and shortcomings, which the first and third wills are completely incapable of. First of all, I wouldn't say they're completely incapable of it. I would say that, yeah, 2Vs do seem to be more okay with just kind of like playful self-flagellation, like just being self-deprecating, kind of, being very open. I would say there's an openness with 2V, because I want to explain it quickly. I don't want to dwell on this too long, so maybe I can spit it out. But 2V doesn't fear its identity being broken or shattered. Okay, because in other words, it has this kind of like fearless spirit that is elastic. It's not fragile, it's not brittle. Okay, so it's open and it's okay with some negative imputations to it, because there's just a feeling that, like, okay, yeah, like I made a mistake or whatever. I'm I have this bad quality, but there's potential for me to change, right? Because it's adaptable, and it doesn't fear the other, like 1V and 3V do. Okay, and it's willing to change. Like 2Vs will be like, okay, this is a negative part of me, but they have strong. Their volition is strong, right? It's on the top. So they're willing to change and to continually evolve and adjust themselves. Okay. La Bruyere, I don't know how to pronounce that, calling the second will true greatness in his classification of characters, wrote, false greatness is arrogant and unapproachable. It is aware of its weaknesses and therefore hides, or rather shows itself a little, just enough to inspire respect, by hiding. This is your real face, the face of insignificance. True greatness is effortless, gentle, heartfelt, simple, and accessible. You can touch it and look at it. The better you get to know it, the more you admire it. Moved by kindness, it bends towards those who are lower than it, but it costs nothing for it to stand up to its full height at any moment. It is sometimes carefree, careless of itself, forgets about its advantages, but when necessary, it shows itself in all its splendor and power. It laughs, plays jokes, and is always full of dignity. Next to him, everyone feels free, but no one dares to be untied. He has a noble and pleasant disposition, inspiring respect and trust. The simplicity and openness of the second will is not always for its benefit. Firstly, dishonest people sometimes take advantage of these spiritual qualities. And secondly, a well-deserved image is created of a being who is quite naive, primitive, limited, who very simply understands people, which is the most perfect truth, growing from the heroic mental health of the nobleman and ordinary human egocentrism, interpreting the whole world according to his model. Right. So the 2V type, because they have that sort of buoyant, anything is possible kind of mentality about the world, they feel that way about people. And so they see they see the potential of people more than the dingy and disappointing actuality. Okay, so they're willing to hold out for that potential, because if only such and such, if you only you change this about yourself and you did this and this, then you could be on your path to greatness, right? And that's how 2V kind of feels about people, just optimistic, right? Because the second position is optimistic, and yeah, so 2V is going to potentially do that to a fault, hold out for people too long. Okay. The second will is fearless in dealing with people. Her ideas about the norm in relationships are limited to the image of a close, equal, friendly circle. However, she considers herself not to have the right to impose her norm on others, and therefore willingly maintains the distance in the relationship that the opposite side offers her. Whatever distance you place a nobleman from yourself, that's where he, as a delicate person, will stand in the future. Yep, I can see that. The nobleman often leaves the impression of himself as a person who is rather indifferent to people. You have always been indifferent to people, to their shortcomings and weaknesses, like Mizanova about Chekhov. His external kindness is an internal indifference to the whole world. Sophia Tolstoya about Teneyev. Sometimes a nobleman speaks of himself as an indifferent person. Berdiev, for example, admitted, "I probably have a lot of indifference and no despotism or inclination to violence, although I've been autocratic in my activities. There is great respect for every human person, but little attention. I have never had a tendency to tinker with the souls of people, influence them, guide them." Yeah, and that's interesting that he puts this here. I'm not really sure what to make of it, because it seems like in other descriptions, like on attitudinalpsyche.com, it seems like 2Vs can be like guide-like, and the second position generally is like kind of guide-like, especially because it helps guide the sort of wandering and lost, third position complement to it. So that's interesting. Although I would say that I have absolutely no interest whatsoever with like manipulating people or trying to like subtly influence them. It's just I've never had that interest. Now you might say, well, you're just saying you're a good person because it's bad, but it's like there are people who are just honest. Like yeah, like they're into like manipulation. They're into, I don't know, like neuro-linguistic programming, or they're charmers, right? But yeah, to me it's like I guess I just kind of hope things work out. And I hope the best for people's potential, and I want to collaborate with them, but I guess yeah, maybe like tinkering with them, in like this kind of dominant position, that has no interest to me. So maybe that's what he's getting at. Despite all these reproaches and confessions of indifference, there is not an iota of truth in them. Right, okay. The second will is very partial to people, and there is no more sympathetic person than a nobleman. Another thing is that he is not curious. Frankly speaking, curiosity is not the healthiest of feelings, dictated either by fear or self-interest, or in any case, some form of personal interest in other people. A nobleman is a delicate, disinterested, fearless, self-sufficient, independent creature, and besides, as is the custom of people who see others in their own image and likeness, and therefore incurious. Hence the myth about the indifference of the second will. Hence the biggest drawback of the nobleman: he is not a psychologist. Gullibility and lack of curiosity deprive him of the opportunity and desire to look at the secret, hidden side of life of someone else's soul and respond adequately to it. About Vladimir Solovyov, one contemporary reported, "Once he told me about himself that he was not a psychologist. He said it in different words, but it was noticeable that he regretted his lack of this trait. Indeed, there was some blindness and rashness of the cavalry in him. Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So it's like, yeah, I can see that. Like you said, like the lack of curiosity, meaning looking into people's dirty laundry. You know, like some people might be interested in what the you know terrible thoughts and that someone else might have and what dirt you can dig up on them or whatever. But for 2V, it's like it's just completely uninteresting. You don't want to know. Um, and yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm wondering how to connect that to the essence of 2V, um, to flexible willpower. It seems like a proper observation that rings true to me, but yeah, I don't know how to connect that to um, yeah, 2V, just more abstractly. Another misconception often harbored about the second will by those around him is his supposed softness and weak character, and it cannot be said that it was completely unfounded. The nobleman, unlike the Tsar, has a solid foundation of character that is not prominent but hidden. He is soft, compliant, tolerant, flexible, indulgent towards himself and others, faithful in friendship and love, which is also sometimes interpreted as weak character. This plasticine appearance of the nobleman deceives many and, in its own way, provokes those around him to test his character, to be rude, to humiliate, to subjugate. The results are usually disastrous for the experimenter. For the plasticine shell suddenly emerges a natural aristocrat, a proud man, a man of unbending will, capable of dying rather than giving up an inch of his dignity. Uh, yeah, I've had people try to test me in the past, and while I'm not going to fight them, but they quickly realize that I'm not a bitch. um, so yeah. Those who try to experiment with the character of a nobleman and test his teeth simply forget a rather banal truth. Banal truth. Only very strong people can afford weakness. One of the people who knew Chekhov well wrote, Chekhov's will was a great force. He took care of it and rarely resorted to its assistance. And sometimes it gave him pleasure to do without it, experiencing fluctuations, even being weak. Weakness is a kind of charm that women know well. But when he found that it was necessary, meaning, okay, by the way, weakness is a charm that women kind of feign weakness because it's charming. And so 2Vs, I guess, do a similar thing. But when he found that it was necessary to call upon the will, it appeared and never deceived him. Trying to determine exactly the line beyond which the second will begins to manifest its solid foundation is almost hopeless. But it is clear that every time we talk about some fundamental issue, uh, it is clear that that line becomes clear every time we talk about something fundamental. In Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, Lisa asks Alyosha Karamazov, uh, will you obey me? Yes. In everything? In almost everything. But in the main thing? No. I won't give up the main thing. Similarly, Abraham Lincoln lived and acted like a Karamazov. Whitman wrote about him. On those rare occasions when it came to something cardinal, decisive, he was unshakably firm, even stubborn. In general, when it came to something not too significant, he was compliant, flexible, tolerant, extremely pliable. Okay. Flattering a nobleman is as useless as humiliating him. The aroma of incense causes him the most sincere irritation, a feeling of awkwardness, and I have more than once seen how the faces of the nobles turn crimson, even in the case of well deserved and moderate praise. And by the way, I think the aroma of incense is like a metaphor, meaning flattery, essentially. Perhaps the most unique feature of the psychology of the nobleman lies in the non hierarchical nature of his picture of the universe. Let us remember that for the first will, the cosmos is divided into above and below. So the second will does not have this antinomy, in its internal picture of the world. In the human spirit, as well as the universe, There is nothing that is above or below. Everything requires equal rights to a common focus, believed Goethe. For the nobleman, everyone, from God to the tadpole, is on the same line. Everyone has equal rights in the desire to fulfill their destiny. Pasternak very accurately called this non-hierarchism of the second will the noble sense of equality of all living beings. And Berdyaev, for example, admitted, I have completely atrophied any sense of the hierarchical position of people in society. It does not follow from what has been said that the second will completely denies the existence of a hierarchy that is too obviously manifested in our lives. No, but she does not absolutize it. The nobleman perceives hierarchy as a convention, a formality, a system of labels, perhaps not useless, but not attributable to the ontological, essential side of being. Chekhov wrote, I equally have no special predilection for gendarmes, nor for the butchers, nor for scientists, nor for writers, nor for young people. I consider form and label a prejudice. My holy of holies is the human body. Health, mind, talent, inspiration, love, and absolute freedom. Freedom from force and lies, no matter what the last two are expressed in. And I believe he types Chekhov as a 1F, so it would make sense, like, for him to say my holy of holies is the human body, right? Not totally sure about that, but pretty sure. And yeah, I do agree with that. Like, I do, politically speaking, have kind of a hierarchical view of things. But even then, I've noticed, being in that milieu, that I kind of default in my actual relations to a very like egalitarian, very casual and like deferential kind of mode. Um, and yeah, I don't have that splitting of the universe that seems to happen in 1Vs and 4Vs as well. Um, so yeah, it's interesting. It rings true. The question is, what practical conclusions follow from the second will's non-recognition of the hierarchical picture of the world? And there are many conclusions. For example, I will not argue that the second will was the creator of the norms of law and morality. They, depending on the country and people, vary too much to attribute their authorship to one psychology. But that the nobleman is the only guardian of morality and law. This is unconditional. And the reason for such a particularly important role of the nobility in society is precisely related to its natural rejection of hierarchy. The fact is that the rest of the wills are hierarchical, and hierarchy is something that, differentiating morality and law depending on the position occupied by the subject at the levels of the hierarchy, practically destroys both, blurs their boundaries until they completely disappear. Okay, so let me read that again because I might have gone too fast there. The fact is that the rest of the wills are hierarchical, and hierarchy is something that, differentiating morality and law depending on the position occupied by the subject at the levels of the hierarchy, practically destroys both, blurs their boundaries until they completely disappear. What is permitted to Jupiter is not permitted to the bull, said the ancient Romans, thereby formulating a hierarchical principle destructive to morality and law. However, they also love to repeat, the law is harsh, but it is the law, recognizing the presence of a different, protective, non-hierarchical, noble principle. From time immemorial, both of these principles have been fighting in the world. Which one will win, the future will show. Most importantly, judging by the fact that morality and law still exist, the second will has not yet lost. Important there. It is obvious that, according to its political beliefs, the second will is a natural democrat, as opposed to the same first will, a natural monarchist. And I want to say that, think about this for a second. He types Vladimir Lenin as a first will type. Now, Lenin, overthrew the Tsarist Russia, which was an absolute monarchy. Okay. Now, remember when he talks about first will types and how, they are often radicals and rebels. It's just when, then of course when they get into power, they are despots. And it's because really they just didn't want anyone else ruling over them because they're first will types. And once they get into power, they're not going to let anyone else rule over them. And so they become despots. He also, for example, in the LVFE description, types Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, as a 2V type. Okay, so 2V types are like natural egalitarians, and natural levelers because they just have, because of their, processional and kind of like normative willpower. Okay, and 1V types are natural monarchists or natural autocrats because of their result oriented and excessive and independent um, willpower. So it doesn't mean that all 2V types are, I don't think Marcus Aurelius would have been a fan of democracy, even though he was a philosophical and contemplative sort of guy. Uh, just like Lenin, um, just because he's a 1V type, certainly wasn't going to institute an actual monarchy again. Um, so yeah, it's like in fact, it's a good example of 2V when you notice like an emperor or like a king or someone is very like egalitarian and very, he values the rule of law. Um, that he might not be a good king, but if he does those things, it's probably a sign that he's 2V because he's kind of like working against his position. At the same point, when you see someone who's pronouncing democracy and equality, but they're ruling like a dictator, right? That's a good sign. That's a primary sign of 1V. And again, it's not that all 1Vs are liars or hypocrites, but it's just a good way of telling like when there's a contrast between their kind of natural disposition and the actual formal position and hierarchy or position and ideology that they're within or expounding. Okay, so power is better than freedom, said Turgenev's hero with the first will. Freedom is better than power, says any second will. The fight between them is also predetermined from time to time, but the picture of the combat is clearer. For now, the second will is clearly winning. A growing number of countries are governed by elected bodies that proclaim the primacy of individual rights over all other rights. And yeah, we live in a democratic age. Maybe we live in a 2V age overall, and it kind of remains to be seen whether that age is, working out for the vast majority of people. I mean, humans lived in monarchies and autocracies for a long time. And during that period, the human race, evolved as a civilization, right? Um, so, yeah, it's not, I mean, again, 2V, remember what he said about 1V, where it's like in times of crisis and war and conflict, like 1V can be a very good thing because it unites a society. And at least, although maybe the unity isn't perfect and maybe the 1V leader takes a lot of liberties, he scoops a lot of liberties off the top of the society, like at least he gets something done, right? And 2V is processional and would rather 2V would almost rather things nothing get done or thing, not exactly like that, but 2V is, it prefers freedom over power. So if freedom is an obstacle to uh, the development of society, then 2V might choose freedom, and maybe we needed some autocracy. Uh, yeah. So basically, what I'm saying is like, you know, I'm trying to show how we shouldn't take for granted that our democratic age is actually an absolute good, because that kind of remains to be seen, and it's not true that like 1Vs are just like the bad guys. Okay. Um, the castlessness of the second will naturally extends to its relationships in the family, at work, among acquaintances. The nobleman is equal with superiors and subordinates, parents and children, in a friendly circle. Moreover, this evenness is shaded by a sense of self esteem, combined with a respectful attitude towards others. Bunin wrote about Chekhov. It happened that people of the most diverse ranks gathered with him. He was the same with everyone, did not show preference to anyone, did not force anyone to suffer from pride, to feel forgotten, superfluous. and he invariably kept everyone at a certain distance from himself. His sense of self-esteem and independence was very great. Take a sip. The attitude of the nobles towards social movements is quite peculiar. It is accurately described in the following autobiographical lines of Berdiev. I was imprisoned 4 times, twice in the old regime and twice in the new. Was exiled to the north for 3 years. Had a trial that threatened me with eternal settlement in Siberia. Was expelled from my homeland and will probably end my life in exile. And at the same time, I have never been a political person. I was involved in many things, but in essence, I did not belong to anything to the core. I did not devote myself completely to anything, except for my own creativity. The depth of my being always belonged to something else. Not only was I not indifferent to social issues, but I was also very sick of them. I had a civic feeling, but in essence, in a deeper sense, I was asocial. I have never been a social activist. Social movements never considered me completely one of their own. I have always been a spiritual anarchist and an individualist. Right, and think too that, think the second, a 2V type has a first function. So, like, their true kind of end is not going to be willpower, right? It's going to be whatever their first function is. What Berdiev described is not a personal position, but a general picture of the world. Sorry, but a general picture of the social asocial psychology of the second will. Our task is only to consider it through a single prism of noble values. The civic feeling described by Berdiev is the non-caste nature of the second will, which, embodied in the close slogan, freedom, equality, brotherhood, is capable of involving the nobleman in large social movements. On the other hand, natural independence, a deep sense of the uniqueness of one's own individuality, do not allow the second will to completely merge with the crowd, dragging it to the margins of social movements. The crowd presupposes some form of delegation of individual wills to those who lead it. But transferring one's will to others is completely unacceptable for the second will, and appropriating someone else's is uninteresting and unfruitful. Your own and others' freedom, even in the struggle for freedom, for the nobleman, it is most precious. So he walks along the party-non-party line, sympathizing with many, but not merging with anything. Yep, very, very true. Rarely does the second will come into open, uncompromising opposition to the existing order of things, preferring not to confront, but simply to isolate itself. Goethe frankly spoke about his undemonstrative tendency to isolate himself from everything that can be called social tyranny. Never in my life have I entered into a hostile and useless opposition to the powerful stream of the masses or to the ruling principle, but I've always preferred, like a snail, to hide in the shell and live in it as you please. Taking the interaction of the second will with the world in a broader ontological sense, it is better to characterize it by the formula of the same hypostatic inseparability and non-fusion as that of the first will. However, there is a significant difference between these two types of interaction. The king, building his relationship vertically, does not imply complete merging with the world, even in theory, while the nobleman and the world are on the same line and sincerely strive for each other, intending to achieve absolute unity at the end point of the movement. It is assumed, however, that due to the normativity of the second will, the world should rather move towards the nobleman than vice versa. Yeah, that's a great paragraph. I mean, I think that's got a lot in it. I like when he talks about this kind of projection of the position of the will onto the universe. I find that interesting and very, yeah. There's a lot there, and I think in the future I'm gonna consider it a lot more when I think of these, first will versus second will. Yeah, it's very cool. So, what I am now trying to express in a confusing and verbose manner, I don't think it's that confusing actually. Pasternak, a poet par excellence, said in 4 lines, "All my life I wanted to be like everyone else, but the century and its beauty is stronger than my whining and wants to be like me." Neat. At the same time, the nobleman's self-confidence is only partly justified. Its standard is more a potential than a reality. More precisely, the exemplary nature of the second will forces a nobleman to consider himself a model along with other completely non-exemplary functions, which makes the second will sometimes strangely deaf, shameless, and persistent. For example, the St. Pasternak loved to tell without a shadow of embarrassment how he almost drove a minor literary official crazy with a 3-day hysterical monologue of his first emotion during a joint trip on a train. So yeah, that's kind of an important point. It's like, okay, yeah, second will is so great, but then that means the other three functions are in kind of like the less auspicious positions. Okay. The attitude of the second will to fame is also better conveyed by one short quote from Pasternak. Being famous is ugly. Let us note that the word ugly has a double aesthetic and ethical meaning in Russian. And here, one cannot fail to recognize the success of the choice of the poetic word, because in the opinion of the nobleman, the desire to get into the limelight under the roar of human applause equally smacks of bad taste and mental illness. Yeah, and I just want to say there, it was funny because a couple paragraphs ago I was thinking of the band Rush, Neil Peart, and they're like Rush is an extremely 2V band. Like if you know Rush songs, you listen to their lyrics, they're very. It's just so 2V. It's like too much 2V. But so many songs. I mean, I'm a big Rush fan. Have been since I was a teenager. A great example is New World Man. Listen to that song, New World Man, and you'll get 2V very very clearly. And then here, of course, they're talking about the Limelight. I mean, listen to the song Limelight. Okay. All right. I've always been seduced by Incognito, wrote Berdiev, accurately expressing the general dislike of the second will, perhaps not so much to fame. Okay, expressing the dislike of the second will, not so much to fame itself, but to its shameful attributes. Hype, pomp depends on the crowd. I don't know how to pronounce this word. Panegyrics. I'll have to look that up later. Invasions of privacy, etc. By and large, the nobleman does not crave fame, but complete self-realization. What level of the social ladder will his process of self-realization take him to, and what will be people's opinions on this matter? Then this is the 10th matter. Tolstoy wrote about one of his brothers. Matenka must have had that precious character trait that I assumed in my mother, and which I knew in Nikolenka, and which I was completely deprived of. The trait of complete indifference to people's opinions about myself. Always, until very recently, I could not get rid of concern for people's opinions, but Matenka did not have this at all. Here I must correct Tolstoy a little. The second will, which his brother Dmitri had, is not indifferent to public opinion, but not curious, not inquisitive towards it. As for the rest, everything is the same as with people. Pleasant words make you happy, unpleasant words offend you. The mention of Dmitri Tolstoy gives reason to add something else to the appearance and role of the nobleman in society. The fact is that, according to such authorities as Leo Tolstoy himself and Turgenev, Dmitri was much more talented than his brilliant brother, and if he had even a grain of vanity, the laurels of a great writer would not have passed him by. This circumstance is very symptomatic. No matter how gifted the second will is, it is not to say lazy, but due to its indifference to glory, does not know a feverish passion for action and thus often deprives itself of a place in the pantheon. Yeah, that place is going to go to the 1Vs and probably 3Vs. There's just that others negative, like striving up against the world feeling that 1Vs and 3Vs will have that causes them to do, great things. And 2V oftentimes is just going to simply be, sort of content. And again, it's normative, right? To be a figure who seriously shakes the hands of the historical clock is not at all the role that nature assigns to the second will in society. The second will is the salt of the earth, a certain guardian Vishnu, meaning the maintainer of the universe, not the bringer of things into existence or the destroyer. He is the maintainer. The invisible skeleton and support of a world torn apart by ambition. And who knows what our society, fiercely fighting for primacy, would have looked like if it had not constantly looked back at the deceased carefree nobility. Right, so if we didn't have the examples of two V's. Like think of Marcus Aurelius, right? He was a kind of a model, philosopher king, right? If we don't have those examples of two V's, then we would be a far more kind of like ambitious, bloodthirsty world, right? Although Dmitri Tolstoy did not become a writer, by the very fact of his existence, he calmed and ennobled the spirit of his brilliant brother, shaken by paroxysms of vanity, and invisibly dictated to him the most profound and pacifying pages of his works. So we can say that Dmitri Tolstoy, in a unique way, noble-like way, invisibly realized himself as a great writer. A noble man is first of all a man, and only then has a social function. Therefore, no matter what social heights he reaches, no matter how stunning his success may be, those around him continue to value and love him as a person. Zelig wrote about Einstein. Many times he told me that the ability to do scientific work depends largely on character. But the more I worked with him and the better I got to know him, the less my attitude towards him depended on the scope of his scientific achievements. Because no matter how great Einstein is as a physicist and a philosopher, as a person, he means much more to me. The nature of man is such that, willy-nilly and completely uncontrollably, he introduces into society the spirit and the system that lives within himself. The second will is no exception here, and since the inner life of the second will is characterized by benevolence, tranquility, peace, and self-confident strength, then the appearance of a noble man in society brings with it silence and peace. Is something that's weird. Is something similar fat, which in the old days was something similar to fat, which in the old days was poured by whalers onto the raging waves. In this regard, I cannot help but cite a description of the almost magical effect of the second will of Boris Zaitsev at one of the receptions at the Merezkovskys. It was a particularly stormy meeting, like a spontaneously rioting ocean. The speakers tried to outshout each other, arguing furiously. Merezkovsky himself, out of inspiration and with his arms wide open, seemed to rise into the air and soar over this furiously raging ocean, similar to the ocean that once swallowed Atlantis, the Atlantis that was being discussed here. In this moment of the highest nervous tension, Boris Konstantinovich entered the dining room, accompanied by Zlobin. It's almost like reading like Lord of the Rings or something. Oh my god. He entered surprisingly quietly and modestly. And immediately, although Boris Konstantinovich did not utter a single word, the waves of the ocean, which already seemed ready to swallow us, subsided. On that day, unlike ordinary Sundays, no one else argued or crossed the swords of eloquence. Then it amazed me. Zaitsev, by his very presence, brought peace to the thoughts and hearts of those sitting at the table. Later, I had to observe how Zaitsev's presence discharged the electrified, tense atmosphere. It was as if it was impossible to quarrel and even argue passionately in front of him. The figure of Boris Zaitsev, among other things, is remarkable in that his writing ideally embodied all the advantages and disadvantages of the artistic creativity of the second will. Zaitsev himself, in one of his letters, described his aesthetic credo as follows. I wanted to steal so much from God's wonderful world. That's how I'm made. I know perfectly well how terrible, cruel, and disastrous this world is, but everything in it has the opposite. And it is given to see not the ugly, but the beautiful of it, to love more than to hate. From my writing, you will not recognize the fullness of the world. I am one-sided. This is what was destined for me. Comparing Zaitsev with other contemporary writers, one of Zaitsev's descendants said, he is poorer than many, but richer than all. It seems in one thing, in the harmonious structure of the soul. Nothing explosive, no terrible depths, no philosophy, noble, chivalrous tone. And then it might have continued after that, but it got cut off. Peace, goodwill, generosity. This is what the second will infects when engaged in art. It infects viewers, readers, listeners. The difference is that such generosity with the first emotion is somewhat loud, Pasternak, and with the third emotion it is somewhat ironic, Chekhov. In combination with the fourth physics, rather sad than cheerful, Bloch. In combination with first physics, it is more cheerful than sad, Goethe. These combinations practically exhaust the noble artistic menu. And there are some, which is funny because he missed a bunch of potential types there, probably because they just don't make art, or not much of it. These combinations practically exhaust the noble artistic menu, and there is some truth in the words that the art of the second will is monotonous. But this monotony is pure monotony. You cannot get enough of it. If you listen to me, it will seem that the nobleman is an angel in the flesh. An angel in the flesh, which does not happen. Agree. But firstly, he has little sense of his advantages, and delusions of grandeur do not threaten him. Block once wrote in a letter, I really believe in myself. I feel in myself healthy integrity and the ability to be a free, independent, honest person. This is perhaps the maximum of what he knows about himself, of the second will. And this is not surprising. Mental health is as invisible to its owner as physical health. Secondly, the nobleman would truly be an angel in the flesh if he showed the world only his best volitional function. But alas, it has three more functions: imperfect, non-standard, inconvenient, and hostile, and this circumstance greatly distorts the angelic face of the second will. Yeah, and again, I don't even believe that 2B is necessarily angelic, okay? Because I think he's kind of deviating from what I think the essence of will, or what we're calling, this thing that we're calling will, which I call potentia, which is really the spirit. Okay, so really it's 2V just is it has a flexible spirit, an adaptable spirit. Okay, that in and of itself is not good or bad. But due to its kind of positivity, its positive valence of being self-positive and also accepting and normative to the world, okay, adjusting to the world, it often has a positive valence, as I said. But even if that's true, the less positive functions are also still there. So, okay, sure, 2Bs might give this, optimistic and kind of buoyant character, but they also have, a sort of selfish, independent, and cruel first function. They have an anxious, neurotic, and somewhat duplicitous third function, and they have a lazy, irresponsible, indifferent fourth function. So it's not all puppies and roses. Take a sip. The first external sign of the second will, as of all wills in general, is the gaze. The look of the nobleman is benevolent, peaceful, and somewhat absent-minded. He seems to be saying, everything is calm. I'm glad to meet you, but if you want, I won't insist on continuing it. Heine wrote about Goethe that his eyes did not look sinfully fearful, piously, or with unctuous tenderness. They were calm, like those of some deity. And of course he was lying somewhat. Goethe's gaze, like that of any nobleman, did not contain anything divine, but was simply non-vain. The pupils moved, but moved smoothly, and Heine, who could not boast of a calm gaze, partly romanticized this impression of Goethe's gaze. Second will is a very important actress and completely agrees with Pasternak that she should not give up her face in a single bit. Therefore, when a nobleman chooses a career as an actor, he more or less successfully plays only himself, and big laurels in acting unable to gain a career, Reagan. So the 2V is actually not a very good actor because they can only really portray themselves. Their expressions are too honest, for better or worse. They're not 2Es who can kind of take on, 2Es are flexible soul, right? So it's they can kind of change their soul and, have this expressiveness, assume a character, as he described the 2E, 2E example of the guy who was talking to a ballet dancer. It was kind of cheerful and chatty. Director was hey, get on stage, and he immediately assumed the disposition of a doomed king, right? That's 2E. But 2V is not like that. 2V is just too honest, and it's difficult for it to act. Which I find, I mean, that's very true for me, especially being 2E, being 2V and 4E. It's like, yeah, there's no way I would ever have been an actor. How difficult acting can be for the second will can be seen in the example of Bloch, who himself read all his poems except the 12. And the secret of such strangeness was that if the reader remembers, individual parts of the poem are stylized in a square booth style. And Bloch, as was the custom of the nobility, identifying himself with what was spoken, simply could not read them. The second will is the only one of the wills that does not organically digest swearing and obscenity. Regardless of upbringing, it does not digest even when combined with first physics, for which excursions into the field of physiology are desirable and natural. Boris Yeltsin, with his first physics, who spent his childhood in a barracks, a builder by profession, wrote, "All my life I could not stand swearing. At the Institute, they even argued with me whether or not I would use at least one swear word in a whole year, and every time I won. There's no exaggeration in Yeltsin's words. I had to meet people with the same order of functions, people from the very bottom of the social spectrum, and equally intolerant of obscenity. Maxim Gorky, having spent his youth in the company of tramps, until the end of his days, blushed at the word toilet." Obviously, the translation cuts off. I don't really agree with that. I mean, I swear, I've swore in these series. I've seen many 2B types swear. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe this was true in a certain culture that he was writing in. I don't know. Maybe it was true for 2Bs back when people were politer and people didn't speak obscenities publicly. Uh, I don't know, but it just doesn't ring true to me. And yeah, I don't, I don't know. Um, I mean, I don't swear ridiculously so, but uh, I would say maybe a better one would be, it's like, I think insults and disdain. I think it's harder for 2B to be insulting towards others and to be like disdainful. Okay. 2B, I think, does seem to have this more respectful side. Even if 2Vs are being completely assholes, but they will seem kind of polite about it. Um, that I could see. So maybe, yeah, replace swearing with like maybe insults or something. Um, and it's a little bit more true. In Russia, we like to argue about, and this next part too is also very strange. I don't really understand it, but I'll try to make sense of it after I read it. In Russia, we like to argue about what intelligence is. Having a diploma of higher education or a character trait. Uh, okay. So if you classify every holder of a diploma as an intellectual, then everything is clear. Unclear with the character trait, unless you have IQ testing, of course. But now we can say with confidence that intelligence is a character trait and it's a natural property of second will. It is characterized by democracy, delicacy, tolerance, goodwill, naturalness, independence, i.e., all those qualities that are usually associated with intelligence. Are they? And it has nothing to do with education, upbringing, social status. A nobleman may be illiterate, not comfortable with a knife and fork, spend his whole life in prison, and this circumstance will not in any way affect his intelligence. Yeah, I just don't understand this at all. I mean, you'd think that the perception of intelligence would have to do with logic, although we know that intelligence is not perfectly correlated with the hierarchy of positions here, hierarchy of functions, rather. But I think maybe what this paragraph is trying to say is that, like, Harvard man personality, he's a real Harvard man, that kind of like well-rounded, like Ivy League personality. But even then, I don't know if that's true completely of 2V. But Yeah, I would just say this paragraph isn't very useful. Maybe you can just say that two V's have a, I don't know, like a just have a natural goodwilledness and independence. I don't know about like delicacy. Yeah, it's not really. I don't know. You could forget this paragraph. It doesn't really make sense to me. But what is common in the taste of the second will is that she prefers clothes, and it's interesting that at the end of these will sections, he's describing clothing. You would have thought that was maybe more of a physics thing, but for some reason, I think because of the, you could say like, I don't know, sumptuary or the social status element of clothing. Maybe, clothing has something to do with, will. What is common in the taste of the second will is that she prefers clothes that are discreet, but also do not blend in with the crowd. The main task of a nobleman when choosing a dress is quite difficult. After dressing, not to be conspicuous, and at the same time, feeling that individuality has not been lost. The cut is preferred to be loose, wide, and not restricting movement. Among politicians, nobles can be immediately recognized by the way that they, at every opportunity, rush to unfasten their buttons, loosen their tie, or better yet, generally change their protocol attire for something homely, simple, and free. Okay, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, it rings true to me. I don't know if it's type related, but as soon as I get home, I'm like in my comfy athleisure slash pajamas, home outfit, and that is kind of how I prefer to be, just kind of comfy, loose clothing, non-formal. All right, so we'll move on to first will. This is still we're moving on to third will. This section has still been shorter, despite all my prefacing, than the first will section. So yeah.